Sometimes you watch something as a kid and it strikes you with the depth of its narrative, the layers of the world it presents, and leaves a lasting impression of an incredibly nuanced story. Then you watch it later in life and you see why your kid self thought it was amazing, but recognize that it's more a scaffolding than the masterwork you remember. As a child of the 80s, for me, it was Macross. But for many, a cohort younger than I, Exo-Squad held that place. And while it is one of the most 90s things you will ever look upon, with the garish colors and the overuse of E as a prefix, it also presents a story that could be retold in a much more realistic way while still being true to its core and its characters. Because there's something really good in there with its mashup riffing on post-colonialism, the rise of totalitarianism, slavery, war, genocide, all presented in its over-the-top visual style hung on a story of a squad of soldiers fighting against imposing odds. We get the backstory in about a minute of intro.
It was a golden age for all mankind. Using the incredible exoskeletons called E-frames, we had successfully terraformed Venus and Mars, and were poised to move on to the outer planets.
Peace and prosperity abound. Except for a little revolt that had to be put down. See, agriculture and construction on freshly terraformed planets involves a lot of drudge work, so we created a race of genetically engineered workers, the Neo-Sapiens. But wouldn't you know it, those ungrateful blue bastards didn't want to be slaves and decided to revolt. A lot of people died, much fighting in mech suits they call E-frames ensued, and the Neos ended up in control of Mars. But that was half a century ago. Now they're a friendly nation in the Homeworld's alliance.
Mr. Secretary General, may I be heard? The chair recognizes Governor General Phaeton, Chief Delegate of the United Martian Commonwealth.
Or so it seems. Phaeton here, the benevolent leader of the Neo-Sapiens, actually has a nefarious plot afoot.
Soon the vermin will not dare to make fun of us.
Patience, Livia, patience, all in good time.
He lets the human governments get all worked up about some space pirates, resulting in the bulk of Earth's military, the Exo-fleet, lurking around Saturn when the Neos launch their war. Earth and Venus get pummeled, the Homeworld's assembly snivels and surrenders.
Sir, as representatives of the Homeworlds, we surrender. And history will record the inevitability of your decision.
And Phaeton renames Chicago after himself. The mayor is very accommodating.
Humans can be stubborn. You'll need help organizing them. And as mayor of Chicago, excuse me, Phaeton City, I can find some cooperative humans to help you keep the others in line. Of course, they'll want special privileges.
The way the series looks at collaborators from multiple angles is one of the things that sets it apart from a simple good guys versus bad guys, men versus monsters kind of story. Besides the craven politician, there's Algernon, the scientist uninterested in politics as long as he can do his work.
I don't care about your wars. I'm a scientist. My allegiance is to my work.
And of course, several iterations of people faced with a choice between starvation or betraying their friends and family to the occupation.
You're trading people for food? Who are you to judge? You don't know what it's been like.
This element of the Neo-occupation, trying to starve out the humans, but also using that process as a means of rooting out the most dangerous individuals, adds layers of depth to what could have easily been a simple fighting big bad guys story. One thread that really stands out for me in the first season is that of Sean Napier, booted from the fleet for insubordination and now a cop in Chicago. His ex-wife is a reporter. The instruments of controlling action and perception don't always get along that well.
Throughout history, human beings have longed for someone to save us from our own violent natures. Now that dream is a reality.
Oh, I hate that collaborationist witch.
You ought to try living with her.
These two characters, both individually and the dynamic between them, is an underutilized thread that I would make central were I trying to adapt this story. So when most people still think that Phaeton is a big friendly blue man, Napier thwarts an assassination attempt. And while the rest of the season mostly ignores the second guessing that he no doubt experiences every waking moment after the war starts, it does do some other interesting things. After his escape from a labor camp,
Our benevolent leader, Phaeton, will give you an opportunity to serve the new Neo-Sapien order through hard work. Refuse this work, and we have a permanent solution to the human problem.
He links up with a bunch of scavengers that he turns into a guerrilla group. They have a pretty steep learning curve before they're effective, but they get there. Meanwhile, his ex-wife, Amanda, is acting as a smiling face for the occupation. She gives these fawning interviews with Phaeton, presenting him as a man of the people trying to correct injustices and bring humans and Neos together. Later, she's interviewing the former president at a re-education camp in Cuba, though it's presented as a resort.
Play! Over there where the camera can see you! And have fun!
The president is obviously under duress.
Thank you for joining us, Mr. Parian. I'm sorry to take you away from your swimming.
It's not all recreation here. We have hard work to do.
Really? Tell us about that.
We have learned about the decades of mistreatment suffered by the Neo-Sapiens. We have learned the true history of the Neo-Sapien revolt on Mars.
But she just rolls with it. If someone today was writing a caricature of an establishment mouthpiece that thinks they're a social justice activist, they could just copy Amanda here with her rose-colored neo-goggles and bubbling, self-loathing Terran guilt.
The Neo-Sapiens aren't evil, Sean. They're reacting to decades of persecution.
When the camp is liberated, her ex drags her along to see the truth, but she's so boxed in by her own ideology that she's blind to it.
Look, maybe the Neo-Sapiens did try to make this camp look like a resort instead of a prison. Sure, they're using it for propaganda, but that doesn't mean they're evil.
You just don't want to see the truth.
I believe Phaeton's order, with all its faults, is the best way for the future.
And in the end, after she's outlived her usefulness, the Neos haul her off. It's a story all too common for those who realize too late that those they thought were their partners were in fact their masters. But while Amanda is a collaborator for ideological luxury belief reasons, others have much more basic motivations. Napier's resistance cell has an informant.
And if you wish to see your husband and child again, find out where they have taken Zenobius.
Diana, having been told that her husband and child are prisoners of the Neo-Sapiens, makes a deal to secure their release by feeding them information about the resistance. She clings to hope, and that lets them manipulate her. She does a good bit of damage before discovering that her family was killed anyway, and turns to revenge against the Neos. She has a redemption arc, helping the squad destroy a key Neo facility, and she ends up being captured and executed.
I promise you, your death will be particularly unpleasant.
You can kill me, but you can't destroy the resistance.
Another story that probably deserved a little bit more attention. And while some of the collaborators are motivated by hunger, a few are driven simply by greed. This doesn't give us a simple us versus them story. There's multiple facets, and it's not always easy to tell who's on whose side at any given moment. But one of the most interesting collaborator stories goes in the other direction. Marsala is a Neo-Sapien member of Exo-Squad fighting against his own people. He's not some puppet. He was one of the leaders of the original Neo-Sapien rebellion and sort of a brother to Phaeton, in that they were produced in the same batch. Because Neos can't breed, they have to be artificially produced. The character relies a little too heavily on the smart alien doesn't understand human things trope. He doesn't get jokes, that sort of thing. There's a scene where he's playing cards with the squad and doesn't understand the idea of a bluff.
Bluffing?
Trying to scare the others out of the game by betting as though you have excellent cards, when you don't.
It's one of many little moments showing him bonding with his human comrades, part of the team and yet never quite one of them. Jump ahead to an operation on Mars, where they have an opportunity to destroy the Neo's breeding facility. Hey Marsala, me and the crew going out for brews and genocide, you in? Yes, who are we exterminating? Your entire species.
Marsala, what is it? My resignation, Lieutenant Marsh, effective immediately.
Curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal. I mean, who didn't see this coming? Lots of jibber-jabber with Phaeton follows, a little flashback, some brain scans to verify that the turnabout is real.
This supposed defection of yours may in fact be a ruse, concocted by Lieutenant Marsh and yourself. I would feel more secure if I could subject you to a mind scan.
Mind scanners do not function on the Neo-Sapien cortex.
Precisely.
It seems an odd trait for an engineered laborer. You'd think they'd make them easier to read.
I am convinced that Lieutenant Marsh believes you a traitor.
Right, they set up that bluff thing 2 episodes ago. Nicely done. And with all of this, one of Phaeton's generals tries to stage a coup. The power relationships are surprisingly complex throughout. There's a lot of tension between the resistance groups on Earth and Venus and the fleet, with the planet-bound guerrillas resenting the professional military for not being there when they were needed.
Well, you heroes were up there flying around. We were getting slaughtered. You were supposed to protect us.
Hold on. Phaeton tricked us like he did everybody else. We lost half the fleet and a lot of good troopers today.
Yeah? Well, we lost our planet. Now, come on.
The Neo-Sapiens have power struggles with generals jockeying for position or trying to overthrow Phaeton. The whole Neo-Sapien state functions like some newly sovereign post-colonial junta, more concerned with hierarchies of power than actually governing anything. Phaeton himself must make his war preparations in secret, not only from Earth, but from his own government ministers. When one of the competent ones figures out what's happening, he's eliminated.
Deterrent? This isn't for defense. Phaeton's building a force larger than the Exo-fleet. What?
And of course, the Exo-fleet has a mutiny, with an aggressive but not terribly bright captain seizing control from Admiral Winfield, arguing that he's too timid to lead them to victory because he doesn't race off to Earth half-cocked. All of this is done in a rather blunt 90s cartoon way, but one could certainly rework the mutiny into a much more believable conflict over command styles and strategy, with a conquered and occupied Earth in the balance, leading to a mutiny led by officers who aren't really wrong in their assessment of the situation based on the information they have, just not fully aware of all the details that the Admiral is possessed of. As a story, Exo-Squad has fairly solid bones, at least Season 1.
Exo-Squad will be back in a moment. Now, back to Exo-Squad.
At the end of the first season, we have a lot going on. The triumphant Neo-Sapiens, overstretched in their rapid conquest, not only can't reproduce on their own, they have no culture of their own, so they have to adopt pieces from ours. Phaeton governs from a Martian White House. They give fascist salutes. They're borrowing all this symbolism from Earth history because, well, mostly because it's a kid's show and shorthand is the way, but within its own world, they have to fill that cultural vacuum with something. It speaks to something at the core of who they are.
We are not as creative as you Terrans. Are you saying the shield was invented by a human? Dr. Algernon of the University of Chicago. I took credit for his discovery.
It's one of many ways that the Neo-Sapien conquest of Earth makes for a unique alien invasion scenario. They are unquestionably a distinct species. They can't blend in with the native population. But they also have no real cultural identity of their own. They're an echo trying to set the tempo, and to some degree they lack even the capacity to develop culture.
Art is a useless Terran pastime.
Yes, but a study of Terran art may reveal the key to their creativity, their ability to perceive the world in new ways.
The Neo-Sapiens as a people essentially have no past. Their entire history consists of being created to work, a rebellion, and a few decades of trying to run Mars, mostly by copying what humanity had done before them. They're a people fighting for self-determination, but they don't know who they are. Philosophical as well as political self-determination are at stake. Which brings me back to those pirates. Now, on the surface, they're kind of ridiculous, but there's a core of a good story here. They began as convict labor mining the moons of Saturn, but it became less economical with the rise of Neo-Sapien labor mining Mars. So the convicts were just left behind. There was enough basic infrastructure that they didn't just die, and presumably the food was at least partially produced on site in hydroponic farms and the like, so they became their own little nation out there. And living in a mine, they built up their own manufacturing capacity, built some ships, and started raiding. Strip away the black-bearded space cutlass-waving trope, and they remind me a lot of the Belters from The Expanse in the sense of being this rough culture rooted in hard-working people living in hollowed-out rocks with worn-out machinery, neglected and largely despised by the people living in more desirable places. Now, we're well into the second season at this point. It has 3 times as many episodes as Season 1, and it is not better for it. A lot of wacky things get introduced in order to sell toys. Mutant Neo-animal hybrid warriors, for example. Lizard men, crab dudes, and Neo that can shapeshift and ends up a sapient blob. But the most interesting is probably the introduction of the Neo-Megas, created as an intellectual cast to make up for the unimaginative nature of the base model N-Sap. They can be a bit annoying.
Let us hope so.
But they do tie back into that idea of the Neos copying everything they have from their creators, including creating a separate species to perform tasks they don't do well themselves. You'd think that they of all people would see where that goes, but Phaeton is a bit wobbly on the sanity cliff at this point and pushes a lot of crazy projects through. These megas are sent out as nominal advisors to his generals, but they often function more like commissars.
I accept your assignment to my staff. I just want to know what function you will fulfill.
Purely advisory. To employ the Terran vernacular, I am to be the brains of this outfit.
Naturally, this stirs up a lot of resentment, and it seems inevitable that the new megas will seize control. Phaeton has managed to take a single people united in hatred against their former masters and divided them first by micromanaging the war, and then by creating a new competitor.
We believe we should stop making Neo-Sapien warriors and create more Neo-Megas instead.
I'll bet you do. They start to see the conflict in terms of a sort of racial hierarchy.
Neo-Megas are superiors in both races. Just as Neo-Sapiens must dominate Terrans, we must lead the Neo-Sapiens.
It's far from the most interesting idea in the series, but it's one that could have been explored in some novel ways if done in a different format. But of course, Exo-Squad was more about selling toys than telling a coherent story, which is where the second season really sinks into monsters and lasers filler for a big stretch of it. I'm not going to get into all of those threads because mostly they're just not good. With the notable exception of the Thrax storyline. Thrax is a Neo-Sapien fighter pilot, the best they have in fact, but he lacks the bloodthirsty zeal that's needed to get ahead in Phaeton's new order.
There has been too much destruction already today.
So he gets demoted to shuttle pilot. But when things turn against the Neos on Venus, they desperately need competent officers, so he gets put in command of a garrison there.
Are you ready to redeem yourself?
I am ready to fight.
I'm promoting you to Garrison Commander. Come with me.
Part of his orders include detonating some fusion bombs, destroying the city and everyone in it if the humans break through their defense. Thrax elects not to.
I joined this war for justice for the Neo-Sapiens. I will not destroy just for the sake of destruction.
Later on Earth, he orders his men to surrender rather than make a futile stand for Phaeton.
When the Terrans reach this place, I will surrender myself and the troops under my command.
He's a patriot and a warrior, but he's not a butcher.
Even in war, there are some things a soldier must not do.
Thrax brings a much-needed level of reflection and responsible command to an otherwise largely disjointed mess of a season.
No one makes you fire. It's a decision you make for yourself.
But the last few episodes more or less get back on track with the retaking of Earth and the defeat of Phaeton and his doomsday plan. The fleet is poised for a planetary assault, coordinated with the worldwide network of guerrilla groups.
In the early years of the 20th century, there was a civil war in Spain. General Franco was about to advance on Madrid.
Walking into this briefing, I expected a tired D-Day reference, but hey, Franco it is. As part of this, Napier leads a rapid armored assault, starting with the Resistance seizing a tank production plant in Detroit and taking I-94 all the way to Chicago with a tank and mech fight in Battle Creek. It's a stretch of road I've traveled many times.
It's 400 kilometers to Chicago. Those tanks can make that in 2 hours.
Those are some insanely fast tanks. Meanwhile, Phaeton has gone from the master of three worlds to decrepit nutjob in a bunker under Chicago, beset on all sides by the collapse of his empire and abandoned by those who had served him.
Everyone betrays me in the end.
Having lost, he's decided that he's going to blow up the Earth with an antimatter bomb. Also, Mars already exploded. Unrelated incident. Naturally, our heroes stop him and humanity is victorious, but there's a lot of rebuilding to do, both in terms of physical structures and the prospects for Neos and humans to coexist. The Neos are sterile, which is used to convey the idea that without children to tie them to the future, they're missing something vital.
What about the future, the Neo-Sapien order?
I have automutation syndrome. What do I care about the future?
Marsala argues essentially the same point to the Assembly, calling for one more batch of Neo-Sapiens to be created.
Because we reproduce artificially, Neo-Sapiens do not feel a part of the endless cycle of life. To correct this flaw, I propose that one last brood of Neo-Sapiens be created. A brood altered genetically to allow them to reproduce as Terrans do.
A lot of folks are going to think that this is a horrendously bad idea. There's a solid practical argument against ensuring the survival of a competing species in what may very well be a zero-sum existential struggle for the same habitat. So there's of course the whole what does it mean to be human aspect of the story, which is generally overdone and not terribly interesting to me. And that whole what's the point of life without children implication with the Neos, which is a simplistic shorthand for a much broader sense of continuity that they lack. But it also keeps coming back to the idea of separating ourselves from labor. At the start of the story, the prosperous paradise was built on engineered slaves and convict labor. Later, the Neos commoditized themselves, both by creating new forms to do their fighting and their thinking, leaving the Neos to just give commands of what they want and leave the details to sub-races to make it happen. They also clone key individuals, complete with copied memories, so they can step into their roles as needed, ready-made replacements. And of course, most of the fighting is done with E-frames, a mechanized interface between the operator and the world. Phaeton spends most of his time in one of these E-frames as the war progresses, and we could potentially read in a lot to his descent into madness, tracking with his growing dependence on the frame that he stays ensconced within at all times. Tying all that together is the resurrection of Alec, a member of Exo-Squad killed in the fighting on the moon, but brought back at the end through a combination of a brain scan stored in his E-frame and a neo-engineered body.
His internal organs are Neo-Omega, but everything that made Alec de Leon a unique individual is there.
The whole thing is kind of disturbing and suggests, at least to me, something about just how non-human the Neos are. Aside from the transhuman techno-resurrection of Alec, the entire planet Mars is reassembled with the power of gravity and love or something.
Gravity is the response matter makes to the loneliness of space. It's love, you see. The love that moves the stars.
Not gonna lie, some of Exo-Squad was painful to watch, but there's enough good stuff in there that I could see it making a good live-action series. Of course, I'm less interested in Obligatory and their basic tier power armor adventuring than in the guerrilla war on Earth and Venus and the Neo-Sapien society starting out hopeful but already stagnating as an adjunct to humanity, not a real independent culture. These are the elements I'd like to see developed in a grittier, more adult-oriented version of this story. Perhaps we begin with Phaeton, seeing that the Neos will die out, probably within his lifetime. With Mars as their home, they have limits to the ability to breed beyond their sterility and reliance on artificial processes. Agriculture is limited with the lower sunlight, colder climate, and soil that simply hasn't had enough time to become a fertile basis for crops, forcing them to control their own numbers. The Neo-Sapiens are contained, dependent, and dying. Following Phaeton and his brood brother Marsala approaching their predicament differently, Marsala joins the Earth military, one of very few Neos to do so, and works to make the best place for his people in the human world. Phaeton sees no future for his people down that road. He thinks they're simply being tolerated patiently until the last Neo-Sapien dies out and humanity can forget its mistake. Neither of them are entirely wrong, but both can rightly be seen as villains and traitors by the other. Sean Napier and Amanda as another mirrored pair, showing the occupation from both sides. Napier sees himself fighting for freedom and the survival of mankind, and reviles Amanda as an opportunistic traitor. To her, the occupation is distasteful, but pursuing noble ends, and she's shielded from the worst of it. The resistance, though, is getting people killed, making life harder. She believes that life would be so much easier for everybody involved, humans included, if these terrorists just stopped planting bombs all over the place. All of which gives multiple angles into questions about war and power structures, personal responsibility within group actions, and when it's justified to fight to force the correction of past wrongs versus when to stop whining and take responsibility for your own predicament. And of course, we have to consider this golden age that humanity had built for itself before the war and what it really entailed. Because beneath the shiny Star Trek surface is a society that has no qualms about slave labor, first with convicts who, for all we know, could have included as many political dissidents as vicious thugs, and later the creation of the Neo-Sapiens. Maybe there's more to Admiral Winfield invoking Franco than just a throwaway line. But that's my take. I found the resistance groups and the Neos to be the real meat of the story, with Able-Squad's characters and missions serving mostly as a story scaffold. It's probably not the view of most Exo-Squad fans, but if Netflix or HBO ever wanted to give it the prestige treatment with a live-action reboot, I would happily write an episode script on spec. Whatever the case, I'm not going to watch all of Exo-Squad. That's about as likely as getting more Draca books.